The Diario of Christopher Columbus's first voyage to America, abstracted by Las Casas and translated by Dunn and Kelly. This is a travel account of Columbus on his first voyage, sponsored by the Spanish monarchs who commissioned him to keep his diarios. According to his son, he kept a journal for each of his 4 voyages, but all of these accounts have been lost. The Diario is Las Casas' edition of the first journal. Scholars have been treating this edition as the original and have transcribed and translated it many times. The account is considered a pioneer in a new style of travel writing, which emphasizes empirical first-hand observation. It inspires many historical inquiries on geography, navigation, politics, and economy, and also on the European conception of the Indies as the other. Before going into the details, let's look at the context surrounding the Diario. By the early 1480s, Christopher Columbus, a sailor living in Lisbon, had developed a theory of reaching Asia by sailing westward instead of eastward. He presented his ideas to the King of Portugal to gain support, but the king said no. So he went to Spain to the court of Isabella and Ferdinand and tried to persuade them. They had their doubts, but the idea of being benefited politically, economically, and religiously convinced them to finally say yes and fund his enterprise. So in 1492, he began his first voyage. The Diario recorded his route to America, or India as he called it. On the 3rd of August 1492, he set sail from Palos, Spain. Along his voyage, he recorded strange occurrences at the sea, such as tropic birds, dolphins, that the seawater is less salty since leaving the Canaries, and that the North Star had moved, which caused their compass to malfunction a little bit. On the 12th of October, he sighted the first land, which he called San Salvador. He then continued to explore Cuba and Hispaniola, recorded his encounter with the Indies and the abundance of resources there was. Then on 16 January 1493, he departed from what he called the Golfo de las Flechas back to Spain, facing storms and hardships along the way. On the 4th of March, he reached Lisbon, and finally on the 15th of March 1493, he was back to Palos, the harbor from which he started his voyage. This was the last entry of the Diario. There are many layers to the authorship of this version of the Diario. First, we have Columbus himself as the first-hand witness who wrote his journal in 1492 and 1493 at the request of Spanish sovereignties. Second, we have Las Casas as an editor of the journal in the mid-16th century. He had access to it since he was close to the Columbus family. And lastly, Dunn and Kelly as 20th century historians and translators of Las Casas' Diario. Their version was published in 1989 and is one of the latest versions. The journal was not published until 1825. In Columbus's lifetime, only the Carta a Luis de Santancel, the letter to one of his patrons at the Spanish court, was published, announcing the discovery. It was widely circulated throughout Europe just after his return, and it was translated into many languages. Another letter announcing the discovery was sent to the Portuguese and Spanish monarchs, called the Carta a los Reyes, has some slightly different contents. It was concealed from the public until the first publication in 1989. As for the journal itself, after reading it, the Spanish monarchs and Las Casas were unsatisfied. The crown wrote to Columbus that they would like more navigational information so that his account could be understood. The reason why his account was deemed unsatisfactory was that it wasn't a traditional navigation guide at the time called the Roteiro. It entails technical directions on the route, astronomical and weather observation, and so on. By the late 16th century, there had been instructions for composing the Roteiro with the temporalization of space. This is accompanied by the narrativization of the travel, which is plotting the events as a sequence, making them a historical phenomenon. This is a characteristic of the Diario, along with many of its political and religious connotation, which shows that it went beyond the usual roteiro and was an example of explanatory nautical writing. Travel writing is a record of the encounter between the same and the other, as all travel requires us to negotiate a complex and sometimes unsettling interplay between alterity and identity, difference and similarity. We can see this encounter and negotiation throughout the Diario, as Columbus tried to make sense of a new world he discovered. He was trying to make known the unknown. He referenced known maps and earlier travel accounts to chart the unknown world and give it a coherent geographical image. As he encountered the other, his writing is filled with a trope of wonder in travel writing, characterized by Christian Orientalist discourse, which marked India as a paradise with wealth, beauty, and fertility, with friendly and naive people waiting to be Christianized. I do not detect in them any religion, and I believe that they would become Christians very quickly because they are of very good understanding, he wrote. Moreover, he located the places and gave them names, just as how he gave the island of Guanahani the name of San Salvador, and just as he wrote, "And here in all of the island the groves are all green, and the verdure like that in April in Andalusia." He was attempting to reconcile the unfamiliar with the familiar, to make known the unknown, and perhaps as a consequence, to take possession of the unknown, to make it his own. Before we get into the third section, here is a bibliography of the works I consulted. In the encounter between the same and the other, there is a reflective aspect of all travel writings. In Herodotus's histories, we can see what Mary Campbell called the strategy of inversion. It was not just about us and them, but it was about us and not us. Judging by this, the Diario, in a sense, reflected upon the European discourse on the Indies. What is interesting in this account is that there seem to be two voices on this matter, one of Columbus, one of Las Casas, and they are somewhat modified by 20th century historians. This version is a bilingual edition of the Diario in Spanish and English. In the Spanish transcription, we can see Las Casas' notes across various places, especially on the treatment of the Indies. Here, Columbus recounted when he saw the Indies and planned to bring them back to Spain. "I ordered them detained, and I am bringing them." In the Spanish transcription, Las Casas commented, "This wasn't the best thing in the world." On 15th January, just before his departure from Hispaniola back to Spain, Columbus saw some native youths that seemed to give such a good account of all those islands to the east, that he decided to take them to Castile with him. Las Casas said, "It was very wrong to take them against their will." It is clear that Las Casas objected to Columbus's treatment of the Indies. He was known as the Apostle of the Indians for his prolific writings on the extermination and enslavement of the indigenous people of the Americas. He might have edited the Diario at the same time while he was working on his other works, namely the Histories of the Indies and a short account of the destruction of the Indies. In the Diario, he let Columbus have the authority of the eyewitness, but also modified him to his own intention, just as 20th century translators omitted Las Casas' notes in order to maintain the authority and integrity of the Columbian word. Yet, despite that, Las Casas' pen remained present in between the words of the admiral.